Welcome to the Steady On podcast, where God's hard truth meets your hard story. I don't need to tell you that life gets hard. Life gets hard, really hard. But God's faithfulness is still active and alive in our hard. And these episodes are dedicated to remembering and claiming the promises of a faithful God. I'm your host, Angie Bauman. I'm a pastor and Bible teacher, founder of Steady On Ministries, and creator of the Step-by-Step Bible Study Method. But more than that, I'm a trauma and abuse survivor who carried a heavy weight of shame and worthlessness for many years. And I still struggle, but I live in much more freedom now because I know God through His Word and speak truth to the lies of the enemy with His Word. And that's what we do here. On Mondays, we take it in by studying the promises of God. And on Wednesdays, we live it out with teaching and testimony on the promises of God. So thank you for tuning in, my friend. You are the reason for this show. And I'm so very, very glad you are here. Let's get started. Hello there, and welcome into this podcast episode with me and my guest today, author, speaker, podcaster, and blogger, Jodi Rosser. Jodi and I met through a mutual friend, Mary Rooney Armand, who has also been a guest on this show. And Jodi and I chatted on the phone to prepare for this recording, and I knew right away that I liked her and that you would like her too. She joins us today to talk about finding help for our hurting heart. Jodi knows about heartbreak and loss. She lost a baby girl through miscarriage. She lost a marriage through divorce, and she lost a dear friend through cancer. But Jodi has done something remarkable through her losses. She has allowed the roots of her relationship with God to grow deep. And because of that, she is able to offer hope to others who are walking through seasons of heartbreak and loss. Our verse for this episode is from 2 Corinthians 1:3, which says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort." God is indeed our comfort and our strength. Whether you are walking an uncomfortable road today or walking beside someone else on their uncomfortable road, please know you never walk alone. Let's listen in. Jodi, welcome to the Steady On community.
Oh, thanks for having me, Angie. I'm so happy to be here.
I am so happy to have you. We have a mutual friend, Jodi and I, Mary Rooney Armand, who has been on the show a couple of different times. It's been a minute since she's been on the show, but she's been on the show a couple of times. And Mary, I love her. And I love the fact that she has connected us. And we're going to talk today about help for the hurting heart. And I noticed in your book, Jodi, that Lisa Appelo is one of the endorsers of your book. And that is a name that is near and dear to my heart. And she visited with us several months ago. And I think some of my regular listeners will remember her story. She just has such a compelling story that's filled with hope. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, I'll link it in today's show notes. But in her endorsement, she says that you offer tender steps backed by scriptural truth to make your way through losses you never saw coming. I thought that was just a beautiful way to say what you were talking about. But I wanted to know if you would help us kind of understand your losses. What's she talking about there? What are some of the heartbreaks you've experienced that taught you about the faithful presence of God? Will you just kind of take us through some of your story?
Yeah, I would love to. And first of all, Lisa is a dear friend, and I got a chance to have her on the podcast twice now. And her interview about her book, Life Can Be Good Again, was one of my favorites last year. She's just got a strong message. Yeah. And so I'm so glad she was an endorser for my book. But yeah, so my heartbreaks are a little different than Lisa. We've actually talked because we're both single moms. Sadly, her husband passed away, but I walked through a divorce. I would say that was probably my greatest loss, my greatest heartbreak I've ever walked through. But let me rewind a little bit, because before that, I had a miscarriage. And I think that's the very first time life did not go as I hoped or planned. You know, I think we are going through life and we have these, plans for our life or expectations. And all of a sudden, life, the rug's pulled out from under us. And it's like, wait, this isn't what I asked for, God. This isn't what I wanted. And the very first time that happened to me was my miscarriage. In between my two boys, I'm a mom of two boys. And now I'm going to have a 20-year-old in just a month, Angie. Oh my gosh, it's so crazy. And then my other one will be 16 this year. So they're young adults and teenagers. And in between, though, I lost a baby girl, and it was really hard. I think that's the first loss that rocked my world. And about 8 years later, then I walked through my divorce, which really was, I would say, my greatest heartbreak. And I think that's when God taught me so many lessons. I think each heartbreak, there's been some truths that I've gleaned. But the divorce, I have a broken clay pot. I'm going to tell you all about it in just a little bit. But there's just so much truth about brokenness and what I just thought that would disqualify me. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit too with the shame. And I just realized that actually qualified me to be able to help other people walking through the same heartbreak. Because you know what? Who better to help someone walking through divorce than someone that's walked through divorce? Or who better to help someone that's had a miscarriage than someone that's had a miscarriage? So 2 years after my divorce, I thought, okay, God, I've had enough. And then my dear, dear friend, I had known her since our little ones were 2. And at the time they were 11, and she got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And that is just such a hard diagnosis. And 4 months later, she passed away. And I walked with it through the chemo with her. I would go to her appointments. I was just there as a dear friend. And it was hard. It was hard. That was the one I questioned God the most. It's like, not that the others I didn't have questions, but this one was like, she's a young mom. She's got these young kids. Why? And so that was my last heartbreak that I have in the book. Since then, there's more. My mom's been diagnosed with dementia. I just feel like life, sadly, I think that once we have one hard thing, it's like, okay, God, we've done our time, but I don't think that's how it works. I think God constantly wants to grow us. And a lot of times we grow through our hard times. And that's what I say on the back cover of my book is, what if your greatest heartbreak catapults you to your greatest growth? My greatest growth happened during these hard seasons. I wasn't cruising on a cruise ship and on vacation when I grew the most. It was these times of just complete, utter devastation where all I could do was say, God, I need you, and cry out to God. And he showed up in such a beautiful way each time. And anyways, I know we're going to get into more of that in just a minute, but those are my losses that I've walked through and that I share about in my book.
Yeah, I love that. I want to just a couple of things with that. I lost a girl between my boys as well. So I just want to honor your daughter and honor mine and share that space with you today, because I recognize that my boys are 18 and 13 now. So we have a little bit very similar timeline there with some things. And I agree with you. It wasn't the first time like that for me, but it was a unique pulling that rug out moment where I didn't see that coming at all. I didn't, right. As crazy as that sounds, because so many of us deal with that heartache still somehow when that was my reality, I did not know what to do with that. That was really a difficult loss for me and for my husband. So I hear you in that. And the other thing that you said, I can't remember exactly how you say it, but I say it this way, that it feels like I punched my card. Like I shouldn't have another one, right? Because I've been through this or that. And I'm like, I just like, I want it to be like, no, I've punched my card. And so I can be safe now from the next thing that's happening. But as you just said with your mother, even since you've kind of shared some of these things that have been such pivotal moments for you, there is more. And so I think it's important for us to continue to taking steps in faith. And one of the things that I know you talk about is when we experience trials, we have a choice to run from God in anger or to run to him in faith. And I'm what's that like for you? I mean, I think it's probably like a continuum where we do both sometimes, right? Like I know there's moments where I'm like, Lord, thank you so much for these hard things. I'm learning things. And other times I'm like, I'm punched my card. I'm mad at you, right? Like, I mean, both are true sometimes in the same situations. And so what helps you in these losses? Because even though some of them were a while now in your life, we still have the feelings and the memories and things come up from these losses. And so what helps you remember that you can run to him in faith?
Well, let me say that I think it's really hard to walk through anything without my faith. Like people ask me, how did you get through these heartbreaks? And it's like, I don't know what I would have done without my faith. So I just love to encourage people to run to God in the pain. And here's the thing. I feel like a lot of times people think, but I'm angry, so that means I need to turn my back. It's like, no, you can still run to God with the anger. Like you don't have to have all the answers, and you can still have doubts, and you can say, God, how are you a good God? And you're allowing this to happen. Like that doesn't mean that you can't run to him still. Like I think that's the thing that is so important, is not to turn our backs in anger, but to run to God with the anger. So one of the ways I do it is journaling. And you know what? I highly recommend this. And there is no right or wrong way to journal. So let me just say that. But I just start off with my grievance, start off with my complaint, start off with my why God, or I'm angry, or what emotion. I'm sad, I'm disappointed, I'm frustrated. There's so many emotions. So start with what you're feeling and just say it all, the good, the bad, the ugly. I tell people, I don't want people reading my journals when I die. I want my kids to burn them, because there is so much in there where I'm just honest and raw. There's swearing. There's just, God, this is not what I wanted for my life. And I'm very vulnerable and honest. But then I don't stop there because that's just lamenting. But then I want to turn the script. So then I just say one thing like, God, I know you are here with me. Or God, just one thing I know about God. God, I know it says in the Bible, you'll never leave me nor forsake me. So I'm not alone. Or God, I want to trust you. Help me, because right now I just have doubts. And it doesn't always mean I have the truth and I'm claiming it. Sometimes I know that's the truth in the Bible, but I need help getting there. And so I just am honest. And I tell you, I did this day after day. And it's interesting. I used the Jesus Calling by Sarah Young. And I tell you, it's like she would write these things. And I feel like she would say, like, you're walking hand in hand with me. Like, you're not doing this alone. Or there was just these reminders that God is doing this with me. And I remember one day, I clearly remember this, Angie. I didn't do it one morning. It was a crazy day. And I left the house, and it was the hardest day in my grief that week. And I remember saying to a friend, like, I'm just drowning. I'm drowning. And I realized, wait a minute, I didn't start my day. Again, sometimes it was just a quick cry out, God, help me. It wasn't always a long, drawn out thing. I mean, let's be real. Sometimes we don't get a chance to do it, but I didn't even say that. It was just, I started my day in my own strength, which I did not.
Doesn't last very long.
No, it doesn't last very long. So that night I got the Jesus Calling out and read what I should have read that morning. It was exactly what I needed to hear. And I sat there and I thought, I can't do this by myself, God. And I tried and I failed. And I didn't just fail. I felt horrible. I felt the sadness more. I mean, again, the emotions were all there. It's not like I had my time with God and, ooh, I was roses and butterflies, but I was drowning that day. And I realized this is so important. And one of the things I like to say is the amount of time I spent with God really did directly proportionally help me with the grief. If I even just a couple minutes, but no time with him, those days were my hardest. And so I just made a vow of like, I got to read, even if it's just a quick read or just okay, God, if the day's taking off and I don't have time to read this, but be with me today. Give me strength. Just those words, give me strength. It doesn't have to be. And I felt this Holy Spirit infusement and just be able to, like, because my kids were grieving the loss of our family. I was grieving the loss. I didn't know the tools to help them. We're all in counseling. And I was just one step ahead of them. And some days it was like, God, just give me the wisdom, the guidance. So what do I say to my kids? How do I help them? And he was so faithful. And so I just say, if you turn your back and you walk away, you're grieving alone. And you guys, you already feel so alone. Don't grieve by yourself. That's not how God wants us to do it. He wants us to grieve with him. Maybe there's a support group. When I lost the baby, there was a group at our church called Empty Arms. And we joined that support group. And it was so helpful to have other people, just like you, Angie, you walked through a similar story, to say, this is what's going on. And they could understand. And we'd say, this is what a person said to me and how hurtful. And it was a place to process everything. And you know what? We're not supposed to do it alone. And I think that I like to talk about a tree. I know we're going to get to this in a minute with deep roots, but
yeah,
I'm just going to share this one story because I think when we're going through grief, there's two things. You want to grow your roots deep in your faith. So that's the part with God. But then you want to take your roots and you want to interlock roots with someone next to you to be stronger. And here's what's crazy. I took my kids to see the sequoias many years ago. And at the time, deep roots is like my whole thing I talk about. My podcast is called Depth. My book is called Depth. This is the thing I love to talk about. And I got there and these trees are the biggest trees in the world. And I thought, oh my goodness, they must have the deepest roots. I was so excited. And the ranger there was like, no, they don't have deep roots at all. And I'm like, wait a minute. You're totally taking away everything that I know to be true. What do you mean? How could they survive? And then he said, they don't go deep, they go wide, and they interlock tree roots with the trees next to them. And that they're stronger in community. And I thought, that's what we need to do in grief. Yes, go deep in your faith with God. Get your Bible out. I read books. I read my Bible. I dove deep. But reach out to someone to interlock tree roots with, a support group, a trusted friend, a counselor. I had a counselor that I would talk to weekly during my grief. I also had friends that I could just vulnerably share everything I was feeling. And then I had a support group. So I think we can't grieve alone. That's the thing. And I think if you turn your back on God and walk away, you're doing it alone. And I don't know how you walk through grief without faith.
Yeah. I really appreciate you talking about those roots in two different ways, because I think it really is, it's easy to neglect one or the other. In my temperament, it's easy to neglect the community part where I'm like, God is enough for me. I don't need people. And that comes from my own like woundedness from people, sometimes where I'm like,
Yes.
I don't even want to risk that right now. I'm hurting enough as it is. But God has shown me, and you are reminding me today, how important it is to remember that those roots need to go both ways. They need to go deep and they need to go wide. And I don't need to go wide. I don't think, I'm interested in your opinion about this. Like, it doesn't need to be like a bazillion people, right? But it needs to be this like closely connected group of people,
Right.
or those people that you can be real with. I have a few people in my life that I can talk to about my anger or my grief or my frustration, the same way you were talking about talking to God in that journal, that I can be very raw with them, right? And there's no judgment there, that they just want to hold that with me. And
Right.
I think that's that intertwining of roots outward that you're talking about.
This summer, I took my kids to the redwoods, and the way it works is there's this one tree, and then all the trees circle it around it. So I kind of want to talk about like who's in that inner circle of your trees.
Go, yeah.
You talked about it can't be gazillions of people,
right?
So like, who's in that? Maybe it's a small group. Maybe it's a friend, like your kids' friends' moms, or maybe it's someone in your small group at Bible study or a church, or I mean, I think along the way, there's been many friends. I took my kids on missions trips. We went to Rwanda twice. And so there's people I met along those that are in that inner circle now. And then, so you find these, and I call them faith friends. You want someone that's not going to say, oh, and point you to a thing that would not be healthy, right? Because there's a lot of ways to deal with grief that are, or I shouldn't say deal with grief, to numb the grief, to avoid the grief, that are unhealthy. So you want someone that's got the same faith as you, that's got the same beliefs that you have, values that are going to say, hey, this is what God says, or this is what a Bible verse said, help me, or they're going to give you some wisdom. So I call them faith friends. So who are your faith friends that you've interlocked tree roots in that inner circle? And that's important. And again, it could just be one or two. It doesn't have to be hundreds, and it doesn't, or even five. I mean, it could just, one is enough, but I think there's got to be at least someone you're talking to besides God. It could be both. I think you need the deep roots, you need the depth, and you need the community. You need both.
Absolutely. Let's switch just a little bit and talk to us about shame and heartbreak. How are those two things connected, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think every heartbreak has the shame attached to it. So like, for example, when I lost my baby, I didn't feel like shame, like, oh my goodness, it was just, this is a loss, and it was out of my control. But a divorce, on the other hand, there's just this shame attached to that. It's like frowned upon by the church. It's not what you would have wanted for your life. Not that you would have wanted the miscarriage, but it's just, there's this level of shame piled on top of it. So you are dealing with the disappointment and the grief and the sadness and the anger. And then there's this whole other emotion that's just, and it's so interesting. I was in my counseling and I was like, I don't want people to know this. I wasn't afraid to tell people I had a miscarriage, but I was afraid to tell people I was walking through a divorce. That's the shame element. Like, you don't want to admit that this is your storyline. Yeah. And I remember sitting there with her and just being like, I'm embarrassed. Like, I'm a strong Christian and this is part of my story. And I had to deal with that. It was not easy, but it was this really powerful moment. I went to a Women of Faith conference, and I went to see Lisa Terkeurst. She's one of my favorite speakers. And, they have like a whole lineup. And so this lady got on the stage. Her name was Lisa Appelo. At the time, I didn't know who she was, but she had just written a book called Girls with Swords. And it was all about spiritual warfare. And she shared something that day, and it just ignited in me this thought of, what if this is more of a spiritual warfare thing and Satan's trying to shut me down? And at that point in time, I felt unused. Like, I've walked through a divorce. I'm broken. God can't use me anymore. And that very day in that auditorium, I felt God saying, no, you have a broken heart, but you're not a broken vessel. I can still use you. And this mantra came into me like, this is truth, friends. Like, you may be walking through something right now, an addiction, and you have shame from that, or a divorce, or there's certain things that have shame and don't, but you might be saying, God, you can't use me anymore. Like, how am I supposed to help someone? I have failed you. I felt like I had failed God. I had failed by having a failed marriage. But I realized that very moment, God had a plan for me beyond what I could understand. That was right before I started a blog, and God was asking me to share what I was learning in the midst of my pain. And that was going to birth this whole ministry. And really, it stemmed from the heartbreaks. And so I want to say to someone, you don't know how you can help someone else. By you sharing your story of faith, like, God helped me through this, that's going to encourage and ignite hope in someone else. I think that's why books were such a big part of my healing, is I would read them and it was someone's story, and it could be a totally different heartbreak from me. I remember one of the ones that I love was by Laura Story called When God Doesn't Fix It. Have you read that book?
I have not. No. Mm-mm.
Okay, it is phenomenal. But she walks through something completely different. Her husband has a brain tumor. I mean, it's like, I didn't even have a husband, right? Like we're in totally different arenas. But her book had so much truth and how God was faithfully walking through it with her. And I think that's what happens is we have these stories and we can go and share them. And that story is going to infuse hope in someone else. But the thing is, we feel unused by God, but God's saying, no, just be honest. I think there's a fine line between being honest and being oversharing, right? So I think sometimes people get on and they overshare. So, but there's a part where you could share where God's involved. Like that's the part you want to share. Where did God show up? Where did he meet you? You don't need to give all the details of your family's life, but where did God show up and where did he meet you? And so that moment in time, I felt like God saying to me, like, you're not disqualified. This brokenness that you're feeling is not disqualifying you. It's actually qualifying you even more because a lot of people are walking this storyline, Jodi. A lot of divorces are happening, Christians, and they're feeling this shame and they're feeling unused. And they need to be reminded that that's not true. That's Satan in their head saying, hey, God can't use you. But no, I give grace. I give grace, and I want them to know that they are free. Those shackles of shame are free because I have grace for them. And so that there's a chapter in my book where I share that because I was living that. I was shackled in that shame, and I just wanted to be able to tell people. And so that's a message I think, again, who better to help someone that's walking through an addiction than someone that's walked that?
Right.
And who's better to say, you know what, I'm walking through infertility, and it's someone that's had that storyline. You're not disqualified by your heartbreaks, especially those ones that have shame attached to them. You're actually able to help another hurting heart even more.
I love what you said. You have a broken heart. You're not a broken vessel. That is beautiful. That is a beautiful word. And I think that the shame is the thing that keeps us from wanting to share our story, right? Because if we put it out there, then it's known as if, I don't know, people know anyway, right? I mean, but somehow like saying it is hard, I think. But it's that very place, I think, where we would push that story or deny that story or try to hide that story, where God's like, that's actually the very place where there's so much power in your story that can help, as you said, help other people. And I wonder, how is that connected to your broken clay pot? I'm guessing that it probably is, right? Will you tell us about that? Yes,
I will. Okay. So here's my broken clay pot. And so let me tell you where it started. So I read a book by Susie Eller called The Mended Heart. And this was probably like a year after my divorce. And I was just diving into books. And so she shares about a woman in her book who shares her testimony and holds up the clay pot. And the light that shines through the pot is just this beautiful way that God takes our broken places and shines through. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to break a clay pot this weekend. So I grabbed a pot. I went to the backyard and I just started bashing it against the cement flower bed. And I have to tell you, Angie, it's really hard to break something that doesn't have any broken parts to it yet. But once it's splintered just a little, the whole thing just collapsed. And so then I took those pieces and I put them back together and I glued them with a hot glue gun and I put a candle in it. And then I lit the candle and the light obviously comes out through the top, but the light that came out through the cracks was just so beautiful. And I thought, what if this is like an example of us as someone that's walked through something hard? You know, what we like to do is say, I'm a perfect clay pot. I have no cracks. Look at me. Look at me. But really, as I talk about each crack and say, this is my divorce, this is my miscarriage, this is the loss of my friend, each one of those, I'm allowing someone to get a little inside and say, like, this is how I'm going. This is my life, be vulnerable. And I just saw that the light shines better through that. It doesn't shine out of a pot with no cracks. And so I want to be a light for Jesus. And I think being a light for Jesus in the middle of a heartbreak is just a beautiful testimony, because a lot of times that's when people turn their backs on God. So you're saying, even with these cracks, I want to shine brightly for Jesus. And so it just became this powerful part of my testimony. Well, it's interesting. In the book, I have a whole chapter on the broken clay pot. But after that, someone told me about kintsugi. Have you heard of this? It's where they take pots and in the broken pots, they put gold.
Yes.
So a lot of times we want to hide those cracks, right? And maybe only tell a couple people, but really in this, you're highlighting your cracks. You're like bringing a spotlight to them. You're like, look at God. This is what is happening in my life. And I thought, again, we don't normally want to live like that. But if I was only say to people, oh, my kids are perfect. Oh, I never have a dirty house. And, you know, none of that's true, for one. And second, none of that invites you in to connect with me. But if I say, I've walked through something really hard and it broke me, like these broken pieces, but look what God did. He put them back together. And this is more beautiful now than it was before. Right. And I can then help someone with that. And it's interesting. So after that moment in time, when I had that Woman of Faith conference, About a month later, I had this moment in time where I was like, it's time to tell people. And I didn't want to do it. And I just kept, I had told close friends, but like it was time to let people know. And I remember that morning, a lot of times God would wake me up really early before my kids would wake up. And I remember him just having me sit at the computer and I was typing up. And it was this email that just shared like, I called it vulnerability. It'd be my first blog post that I ever posted, but it just basically said something to the fact of like, we all want to share our best, highlight reel, but here's my behind the scenes. And I shared what had been happening in my life and all about how God had been faithful. And I sent it. God, after I wrote this, God was like, send it to everyone on your email list. I'm like, you're crazy, but I was faithful. And then I went and took a shower. And the whole time I'm like, what did I just do? Like,
can I get it back?
Can I get it back? And then I got out of the shower and Angie, it was the most powerful day I've ever had. I read the responses and you know what? People sharing things with me they never had told anyone. I haven't told anyone this, but since you told me this about your story, look, I've walked through this. Or just vulnerability breeds vulnerability and connection. And I was in awe. And I thought, that's my taking my broken pieces and saying, God, use them. And that day, I learned some things about my friends and some acquaintances I had never known. And we got deep, right? It's like that depth in our friendships. And it all started with me being honest. And I didn't want people to know, but then it was like they heard it from me and it wasn't the gossip and the hearsay. And I'm not saying go and send an email to everyone you know, that maybe that's not your path, but God is going to want you to take your broken story and share it to someone to help, even if it just helps one person. And what was interesting after each one of my heartbreaks, about a year later, a friend walked through something very similar, or someone would reach out to me and say, my friend walked through something. Can you help them? And at the time, I remember the miscarriage. I got a phone call from my college friend. Her name was Allison. And she's like, this lady at my church, she just lost a baby at 16 weeks, just like you. I don't know how to help her. Can you email? And at that time we just emailed. Texts weren't even a big thing. It was kind of dating myself. It was a while ago. And I just emailed her and said, I walked through this, and we emailed back and forth that whole summer. And at that time I had no idea how that was bringing my healing full circle. And that's when my life first happened. I know we're going to get to Bible verses just a minute, but I remember at her service, she had a service for her son. She had lost a son. So that was the only difference. The same amount of time, everything. And they had shared about, there's this song called Glory Baby. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Christine Knuckles.
It's beautiful. Yes.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And so I had shared that with her. So they played that song at the funeral. And the pastor said, there's a woman that's walked through this ahead of, her name was Clarissa, ahead of Clarissa, and she's been helping Clarissa. And when my friend called me back and told me that, I was just sobbing like, God, you didn't waste it.
Yes.
You didn't waste the pain. I didn't know that the summer before when I was grieving. I had no idea. I was like, God, why did this happen to our family? Like we lost a baby. And God's like, you know what? I had a plan and you didn't understand. And a year later, you would speak truth into a woman and help her. And guess what? I reached out to Clarissa recently. We kind of lost touch. And I was wanting to let her know that I had a chapter on her in the book. I wanted to keep her real name in it. I wanted to get her permission. It's a beautiful story how God helped me hunt her down. But once we connected, she said to me, you know what, Jodi, I now help other women. And I shared that song with them. And there was a book I had sent her, and she now gives that book to someone else. And it's just beautiful how God takes that pain that we've walked through and says, you can hold on to it. You can never share it. And you can, but then I can't use it.
Yeah.
You could take your broken pieces and you could just cling to it. But if you lay them at my feet, I can make something so beautiful that then you can help others. And it's just so powerful.
I agree. I agree so much. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so moved by what you just shared. And it reminds me of some things in my own life. And as God has allowed me to do some similar things that you're talking about, the thing that I remember so much is when I say out loud how God has been faithful in my journey to someone who's going through it now, I believe it more or something.
Yes.
I trust it more. I see it more. I articulate it better. And then I can't deny it either. Do you know what I mean? So there's like this thing that he does in me by asking me to share my brokenness with someone who's like newer on their brokenness, in their brokenness, if you will, that reminds me of his faithfulness when I was that broken, that since I've healed maybe a little bit, there's this temptation to have some separation from that, where he's like, no, I want you to keep that really close to you. I want you to remember how close I was to you in that place, because that helps you in all of the other places that you find yourself. And sharing what he's done in our life in those places, I think for me anyway, helps me remember that faithfulness. So
yes.
So we're going to talk about
true.
Bible verses. I already know which one you're going to pick, but I'm going to ask you to share. I'm going to ask you to share, what is this Bible verse that is so important to you as you continue to think about offering to others what God has first offered to you.
Yeah. Well, I love what you just shared. And I want to just add one quick thing
Yes,
to that
absolutely.
So I like to think of it like a bridge. Okay. And so sometimes we're the one on the middle of the bridge grieving, and someone that's already crossed over walks back and meets us in the middle and says, let me help you across. Let me offer you, again, all I did was share my story. I didn't have tons of words of wisdom. It was like, well, this is what we did. We planted a tree in memory of her. We, I made a book. I just shared some of the things that had helped me, the books I had read, the truths God had shared with me. Honestly, I didn't have a whole lot, I thought, like in my tool chest of wisdom. It was just the simple things that summer that had helped me. But then we helped them across. And then guess what? Then the next person comes along, and then that person goes. And it's just this constant, beautiful picture of a bridge of, we are either sometimes in the middle of the bridge experiencing the loss, or sometimes we're the one coming back and helping someone across. And I love what you said, and every time we do that, it does deepen our roots, and it does remind us that God didn't leave us alone. And so then when the next heartbreak comes, because guess what, friends, it's going to come. I hate to say it, like, you're ready. I think about when I lost my friend, it was the third one. I think I handled that one the best. Not that I handled it well, but I think I had enough tools in my tool belt that I knew kind of what to do and how to grieve, how to journal the losses and lament. And I just think that then it infuses hope in someone else too, but it also deepens your own roots as you share these truths, and you remind yourself that I'm not alone through it. So this is what my life verse is all about. So it's interesting. After that summer that I helped Clarissa, God gave me this verse, or reminded me of this verse in the Bible. I shouldn't say, but it's 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. I'm going to read it. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, and so that we can then comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. And it's so beautiful because we do get comfort from God. He comes and meets us. And we're not supposed to just hold that tight for just ourselves. We're supposed to then, when the next person experiences the same loss, or even a different loss that's a little bit different, but we could come alongside and say, look at how God met me. He's going to do that for you. And we share that. And it's like this beautiful ripple effect. And it was just, again, that summer, God doesn't waste our pain. God wants you to share your vulnerable story. And I always ask people, who is he tugging on your heart to share with? Again, you don't have to send a whole email out like I did. Like, again, be wise in what you share. But who is maybe in the middle of something that you have wisdom for? You have the part of your story of brokenness will help with their broken story,
Right. And it doesn't have to be the same. Like, I appreciate you saying that. It doesn't have to be the same. Some of the books and things that helped you, they were writing about different experiences, but they were pointing to the same God. I think that it doesn't have to be the same story, and you don't have to have been best friends since first grade in order to be the person God is calling to speak his truth into their broken heart. Yeah. So and I think that's true too. Sometimes I'm like, well, I don't really know that person. I'm not close enough to that person. Those are things that sometimes we're tempted to think too. But no, if that person is on your heart, you are the person to reach out and say, I just want to point you back to the one who has been so faithful in my journey as well, whatever that looks like, in that moment. So you are such a gift. I have enjoyed talking to you so much. I wonder, you are obviously a well reader. That's not the right thing I want to say. An avid reader, because you've dropped several books already, but I'm wondering, I love to share resources, and the ones you've mentioned, I will share and put in the show notes. But is there anything right now that you're reading, listening to, studying that you'd like to recommend to those who are listening?
Yes. Okay. Well, you know what? I do love to give books. I want to say one more quick thing on what you just said.
Yeah.
A lot of times the way I help others is I offer them a book. I love to give books away. I call it my book ministry. And that's, I just say, this book helped me. Maybe this book will help you. And it kind of gives you a way into them where you're not like, do you want to hear from me? Here's my story. And then they will sometimes reach back at you, and it opens up a conversation. And that's my favorite thing to do, is give books away. It's like, I'm so passionate about it. I love it. I love it. So on my podcast, I give books away after every episode, and it's just something I'm super passionate about. And so if a book helped me, the miscarriage book that I gave to Clarissa that she now passes along is Grieving the Child I Never Knew by Kathe Wunnenberg. which I actually had her on my podcast, and now she's become my mentor. And it's just this beautiful way God took our stories years ago. I never knew 16 years ago when I read her book that I would then have her in my life. It's just so many God stories. But recently, I'll do one of my recent ones. Susie Eller, the one that wrote The Mended Heart, she's been on the podcast. The third time she just came on was Prayer Starters. This is her most recent book, Talking with God About Hard Times. Now, the reason I love this book is it is a way for you to get praying. And I think sometimes we struggle with how to pray and we don't know how to pray. And so she takes a Bible verse, which praying scripture is powerful. And I just am not good at it. It's like, how do you take this and turn it into a prayer? I think it's a skill. So Susie has this skill. So she takes these, so at the bottom of the page is the verse. And then at the top is a prayer of that verse. And you can just say it out loud. What I do is I read it. And then I take one part of it and I get my journal out and I add it and then I start writing. And I just let my pen get going. You know, so many times we overthink and we try to like, oh, I have to say it perfectly. But when we just let our pen do the talking, it just vulnerably all comes out, honestly comes out. All the junk, all the good, all the bad. And so that's what I'm using right now. And I just did it this morning and I'm just loving it. So that's a resource. She has a podcast too, where she says them out loud too, if you want to do it that way. But it's just, I think when we're going through hard times, we've got to be daily, if possible, connecting with God. So this is, and it's not long, it's quick, like each one's really short, but it's going to give you a tool to either journal or pray out loud or however you want to do it. Again, there's no right or wrong way, but it was really powerful. My favorite book I read last year, and it actually wasn't a book that released last year, but at the end of my podcast, I asked for recommendations as well. And a lady told me about a book called Anonymous by Dr. Alicia Britt Chole. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's all about your hidden years. And she talks about how, if you think about the ministry of Jesus, he had 33 years of his life, but only 3 years were public, which means 30 years were hidden. And she just talks about the growth in the hidden years. You know, any kind of have that deep rooted growth where we can talk about how the roots grow deep. I love that. So that book rocked my world this year. So then when she was on the podcast, I said to her, what book do you recommend? And she said that her second, it's not her second book, but one after Anonymous is called The Sacred Slow. So I just bought this. I haven't really gotten far into it. I think I've read the introduction, but it's going to be one of those that's like you do a little bit each day over a long period of time and you just dive deep. So that's a new one. And I haven't done it yet. I'm in the middle of it or just beginning it, I should say, but it's one that I'm excited to see. I really like her. She wrote another book called 40 Days of Decrease that you can use at Lent. And she's just very wise and deep. I like when an author goes deep, you know, I like that, you know, depth. That's my thing. So those are, I would say, are the ones that I've recently, anything by Lisa Terkeurst. I loved her Good Boundaries and Goodbyes. I just finished that one, but Susie Eller's Prayer Starters is what I'm using right now in my quiet time.
I don't keep track of this, but I think if I did, you would win as the person that dropped the most books in the podcast interview. I just love it. And I will link them all because I really appreciate the reason I ask, probably the same reason you ask, is because I'm interested when I appreciate someone else's journey and someone else's heart. I'm like, what helps you in that? And so I think that's one of the ways that we do. I love that you give books when people are hurting too, because I think that's just a beautiful way to say, I care about you. This helped me. This connected me to God. Perhaps it will do the same for you. So,
yeah,
Jodi, I just have loved talking to you today. Jodi can be found at jodirosser.com. Her book is Depth, Growing Through Heartbreak to Strength, and it can be found wherever books are sold. And her podcast is Depth. And I will link all of that and other places you can find and follow Jodi and all of these books in today's show notes. And again, thank you so much for serving us today and spending some time here.
I've loved it. Thank you for having me, Angie.
Yeah. And thank you, friend, for listening. Until next time, peace. Sometimes I wish I could let you in on the conversations that happen after I stop recording, because when Jodi and I finished up our talk for you, we stayed on talking about our ministries, and before we said goodbye, we made plans to stay in touch. Why? Because sometimes this ministry road feels lonely, and we recognize God's comfort and encouragement offered to us through each other. 2 Corinthians 1:3 again, this time from the NLT. All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. Thank you again, Jodi, for saying no to the lie that your story is wasted and saying yes to the invitation to comfort us the way God has comforted you. Oh yeah, and thank you also for sharing so many books. Next week, our Take It In verse will be Colossians 4:6, that reminds us to season our conversations with salt.
And my guest will be Dr. Michelle Reyes, and she'll be here to talk to us about how conversations on race and culture are important in our Christian homes and communities. If you haven't yet, I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe or follow the podcast on whatever directory you're using to listen. It only takes a second, and it guarantees you'll see new episodes as soon as they drop. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you're walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.